Hi, my name is Michelle Vine. I'm an artist whose exhibition, Contested Biography, is currently showing at Artspace Mackay. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you about my work. It'd be great to be in the gallery giving an artist talk, but this is a pretty good alternative. So welcome to my studio here in Brisbane. The gallery has sent me through a series of questions. So let me grab those and we'll start talking about the show. Okay. The first question we've got here is, what is the relationship between science and art in this show? This show is very much an exploration of science and particularly a historical female scientist examined through the lens of art. I trained myself as an amateur naturalist and retraced the journey of Amelia Dietrich both through North and Central Queensland, collecting specimens of plants and insects and making work responding to this retracing of her journey. I also travelled to Europe and went through collections, so historic scientific collections, and made work in response to that as well. It was really important to me in this project that the relationship between art and science wasn't just one of illustration. There's this kind of, in some art science combinations, the art is illustrative of the science. I actually wanted to be out in the field performing science as well as exploring the historical legacy of this fairly unknown female scientist. Second question, what other art inspired you when creating these artworks? In particular, I was thinking of the legacy of female photographers, in particular Anna Atkins. And Anna actually was a biologist, and she collected plant specimens. And so the first ever, arguably the first ever book of, the first ever photography book was actually created by a woman, Anna Atkins, and her legacy had been overlooked for a very long time. So it seemed that the cyanotype technique, which was a technique invented in about the 1840s, and it's a technique heavily associated with scientific imagery, particularly of plants, it seemed like a really nice conceptual fit to the type of work that I was trying to do, which was explore the legacy of Amelia Dietrich, who had come to Australia to collect plants and animals and ethnographic specimens in the 1860s. Because a lot of the plant specimens are particularly rare and priceless and very fragile because, dried plants from the 1860s. Although I was in the archive able to go and explore them and touch them themselves, a lot of the artworks in the show are actually derived from scientific photography. So there's this lovely link through to the history of science, the history of art, the history of photography by using that cyanotype technique heavily in the show as well. Question number 3. What was the first inspiration for the show, and how did the work develop into what we see today? Ooh, that's a doozy. I think I could talk about that for quite a while. So maybe I'll talk about the first inspiration for discovering Dietrich's story. I was in Germany and I was studying at an art school over there, and at the end of my exchange I actually broke my leg. So rather than come home, I stayed in Germany to recover. And while I was recovering, I came across the story of Amelia Dietrich in a natural history museum in Berlin. And I thought, well, who is this woman who's being proclaimed as such an important figure in this German museum that I'd never heard of? And here I was from Australia and from Queensland. And, I'd finished art school. I was just kind of hobbling around in a moon boot with not much to do for a few months. So I started researching her story. Being an artist, my way, I guess, of storytelling or recommunicating that story that I discovered is definitely through my art practice. So the works themselves started from a series that I did in my third year of art school at the Queensland College of Art in Brisbane. And I was working on a series of botanical images using cyanotype material. And I wanted to have an individual image for each botanical specimen for what's called a type specimen. So the type specimen is the example of that plant or animal for which it is named in the Western scientific system. And I think, there's something like 500 type specimens of plants in the herbarium at Hamburg that Dietrich had collected in Queensland. I managed to make about 90 in total. And quite a selection of these is on show in the Mackay show. But I think it's important to highlight that when something is discovered in Western science, that's a very loaded kind of colonial term. And of course, Australian Indigenous people have had knowledge of these plants and their purposes in the ecosystem and their medicinal properties and so on for much longer. As a non-Indigenous artist, that was important to me to make space for that dialogue. And so I was, in those works in particular, so this is the first work that came out of this project, I was erasing all of the scientific data and leaving space perhaps for a discussion around the fact that there are many ways that we can know the environment and our ecology here in Australia. So with that work in particular, it's about recognising this enormous legacy of scientific information sitting in archives in places like Germany of the really unique flora and fauna of Australia that was there at the time of almost first contact with white people coming into those areas, in particular places like Mackay and Rockhampton and Bowen. So that work was kind of the formative work. And the project ended up running for 5 years. I made 2 new works for the show at Mackay, one being a digital story about the entire project. And you can see that on the tablet in Mackay or access that via the web as well. And that tells the story of what I did both in the field when I retraced Dietrich, what I did when I visited collections in Germany to discover what was still in existence, what was still being held. And it also talks about her life story. So over 5 years, there's been quite a lot of development, and in particular, I was really engaged with using books. You'll see a couple of book works in the show at Mackay. The work that's actually in the collection at Mackay is called Contested Biography, #1. And that work itself is every page out of Dietrich's biography, which was written by her daughter. And I had pulled apart the book and I used this cyanotype technique to create like a very colonial style wallpaper from both birds and plants that had been collected by Amelia Dietrich in Queensland. I think that there's something there where I'm referencing the domestic and the feminine and those usual ways that women were expected to behave. But here we had this rather renegade figure working alone for the most part in the wilderness in Queensland, doing the work that was usually considered work for a man. And she was, 41 when she came to Australia. She was not a young woman in those type of terms for the 1860s, indeed. So really quite an extraordinary figure and a really interesting story that I hope you'll enjoy as you explore both the artworks and perhaps her story through the website work. Well, this is a good lead into the next question. Why is Amelia Dietrich relevant to Mackay today? It's interesting when I started to research her story and I sort of questioned why it was that I didn't know about this figure. I'm about to turn 44, so at the time I went through school, we'd hear a lot about explorers and we'd hear a lot about, some of them being scientists, and people like Ludwig Leichhardt come to mind. And I remember, having to do posters and poster assignments and things like that on him in primary school. We didn't really hear about pioneering women in the same way. I think that her story is relevant because it helps me understand how much of history is written, I guess, by the people that succeed or come to light. But there are so many other stories that exist, and particularly for migrants in the early colony. Dietrich was a German speaker, and she predominantly worked in German circles. She was in the area for 10 years, working between Gladstone, Rockhampton, Mackay and Bowen and Lake Elphinstone. So during that time, she just diligently did her work for the museums, collecting, and as a woman, and she was a very uneducated woman. She was a self-taught naturalist, and her mother had taught her knowledge of herbs and so forth. So she would collect things and then they'd be sent back to scientists, and those male scientists would then publish the records in all of the journal articles and so forth, and so the discoveries went into their names rather than the person who collected them in the field. The other reason that it's important to understand her legacy is that she has come to, from time to time, her name pops up in light, in particular to the issue of the collection of Indigenous remains in colonial times. And this is a really important part of her story, but not the full story. She has been by some journalists proclaimed as quite the devil figure and poster child for this issue. It's a very unfortunate part of our history that I think we need to bring to light. And we can't sort of look at history and cherry pick through the wonderful heroic parts of people's stories. We have to have a look at all of their story in its complexity, and there is definitely complexity in her story. I started off looking at her story thinking, oh wow, there's this unsung female scientific hero, and perhaps part of what my work is doing is shedding some light on that story. But after really researching and really engaging, I realized that there is this dark part to the story as well that's unreconciled sometimes. It's important that we acknowledge her role in the collection of Indigenous remains and how that role was part of an entire scientific and European museum-based system that had a genuine interest in collecting Indigenous remains because of the mistaken belief that Australian Aboriginals and also the Papua New Guineans were part of what was considered Darwin's missing link. For this reason, it was an incredibly profitable business to export Indigenous remains, and graves were robbed. There are a lot of stories about people being killed for bodies. Some other scientists dispute that because they say, unfortunately, there was so much violence in Queensland in frontier times that this was not necessarily something that people needed to do. But I'm kind of digressing there. But I want you to understand that I guess the story that I'm telling with Dietrich is a very complex one, and I didn't want to shy away from that controversy around her. And I don't want to make excuses for her. A lot of the time we hear, oh, well, that was in the past, they didn't know better. But it was really clear that, there was contemporary people writing in the 1860s about how it wasn't moral to treat Indigenous people this way. So we can't use those excuses to excuse the past when you really look into history. It's really important that we remember this and that we honour that tragic part of our history as we continue to grapple with the repatriation of Indigenous remains from European museums. This has been a very big issue, particularly over the last 30 years, and luckily we're seeing some things come back, but not all. So there is absolutely priceless parts of this region and Mackay's cultural heritage for our local Indigenous peoples that are in collections in Europe, and it's great that they've been preserved, but it's also very questionable the means by which they're obtained and whether today in contemporary society, they really should still be in those places, whether their place is actually back here in Australia. Last question. While looking at this exhibition, what sort of experience would you like your audience to have? I would like them to appreciate just how beautiful the biodiversity that we do have in Australia and Queensland is. I hope that they're intrigued by the story as I was and are interested in learning more. I think that as children we grow up with this innate desire to collect. So if I've got two daughters, and I certainly watch them as toddlers and young children wanting to collect pebbles and stones and shells and leaves and so on. There's some of us that still retain that desire to collect, and certainly I have that as both an artist and an amateur scientist. I hope that there is some kind of return to a childlike joy of slowing down and looking at nature and appreciating all of the beauty and the differences in forms that can occur. And there's something about translating the natural world into art forms that can sometimes facilitate that space or that experience where we can slow down and appreciate nature. Thank you so much for listening, for coming into my studio here. And if you've got any questions about the show or about the works, I'd love to hear from you, and I'm really happy to talk to you via the online channels that the gallery gives you the options for. Thank you.